Hi guys, today's video is about responsive design within Photoshop and how it's more of a mindset than any kind of technical outcome or technique that you need to do. So I'll get straight into it. Now I've got a responsive design folder here. I've got two things here. I've got my PSD design that I've put together that I'll go through in a second, and then I've also sliced that up into HTML and CSS, and I'll kind of show you how I've gone from design to CSS, and I'll show you the mindset. So it's always good to see the end result. So I'll open the Photoshop file up. So this is the design, pretty kind of hipsterish design. Nonetheless, pretty basic design: logo, banner, 2-column text, and 3 images. Now I wanted to keep this design simple so I could illustrate how we go about thinking about responsive design. I'll walk you through the layers palette. I've got all my layers in blue that are basically just artwork, and then I've got my all important guides layer. Now if I just bring up my guides, and if I zoom out, I can see it's quite complex, but don't worry about that. I'll walk you through it. If I bring down my guides folder, what I've done is I've got a reference file here, and this basically helped me set up my guides, and I'll go through what kind of grid I'm using. Actually, I might do that now. That'll make more sense for these layers. Basically, when it comes to responsive design, you need to use, or we recommend using, a grid of some degree. This is the one I use. It's called Unsemantic, and this is the demo. This demo basically puts all the different grids and boxes and percentages on a screen, so you can start to gauge all the options that you've got and all the kind of classes that you've got to use. If we scroll down, you can see there's a lot of them, but this is kind of what I've screenshot to reproduce this in Photoshop. Let me show you what happens when I resize my browser to demonstrate what these start to do. So you can see how the values are changing, and then at that point they flick off to 50-50. And if we scroll up again, we can see these values will also be doing the same. So with that in mind, I've taken this structure currently in CSS and built a grid around it. Now let me show you how that works. If I bring up my reference file and zoom in, you can see, I'll turn my artwork files off, you can see how each one of these represents 5%. Each column here represents 5%, 2 of them represent 10%, 3 is 15, so on and so on. And what I've done is just set up some quick guides for me, or reference points: 10%, 20%, or 5 col, 25%, 4 col, and 33%, 3 col. Now, this is just applicable for this Unsemantic framework. Whatever you may be using, Foundation, Twitter Bootstrap, they're all going to be slightly different, so please do consider the framework that you are using, and create a grid in Photoshop that suits the framework that you're using. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one you're using, as long as you are using some kind of grid. I think you'll be fine. So I'll turn the reference one back on and line that up, and you can see now I've got the ability to start referencing columns, so I'm not stuck to traditional kind of layouts. So if I bring up my artwork again, you can see how I've utilized this grid. Everything in the header is 100%, or in this case 20 col. The banner is full width, or 100%. Then I've got 2 text boxes which are 50% each, and then I finish off with 3 boxes that are 33% each, and I'll show you how that looks against my reference. If I just move this down here, you can see that each one of these boxes is taking up 1/3 or 33%. Now that's a lot of numbers, a lot of guidelines. Let me show you how all this looks in HTML, and this might help you with the next step. So here's the HTML version of it. Just quickly sliced it up to demonstrate how we go from Photoshop to HTML. So there's my 50/50 Picole, and finishing off with my 3 images there. Now let's start to see what happens when I resize this browser. See how that image is getting smaller? And so with all the divs. What's happening is when I get to a point, notice these 2 images have gone into 2 columns. So we've gone from a 3-col to 2-col. And what that represents is the difference between a desktop or a laptop going down to a tablet. And if I keep shrinking further down, it will eventually go to 1 column. Now I've got fine-grained control, and your developer will have fine-grained control over when these points happen. But if I zoom in to the smallest one, this replicates a mobile device of some description. You can see they've all started to stack against each other, on top of each other, instead of in 3 columns. You can also notice these black bars. I've taken off when we get to the mobile view to keep it a bit cleaner. Let me demonstrate that in a couple of devices. So this is the desktop view. Let's see what it is on iPhone 4. So you can see the screen's much smaller and everything's adapted to be more of a stacked vertical arrangement. Similar to for the version of 5, a bit taller. Hasn't changed too much, but the height. But then if I go to a small tablet, you'll notice everything's a lot wider. 3 images still stacked on top of each other, but then if I go to a bigger tablet again, we should see the images there. So I've done this on purpose to illustrate the different breakpoints that you've got control over. And then I can go back to my desktop view. Now, this is all really good stuff to consider when designing. I think if you know the basics of what a developer or someone slicing your PSD files is going to do with them and how they're going to work, you're going to be a much better designer for it. So let's look at the thought process from going from a Photoshop file here to something that's fluid. Same assets, but fluid. So the thinking behind here is, and how to mock up this in your head, again, it's more of a mindset, not a technique. I'll just lock my guides. If I bring up the 2-column text, I know in my head that when I'm on a desktop, I want these columns to be 50/50. When I get to a tablet device, I still want them to be 50/50. But when I get to a mobile device, what I want to happen is essentially this. Now you don't need to mock this up. Some developers might ask you to mock that up, but for your initial design, you just need to consider that when we go from a mobile view, a desktop view to a mobile view, this is what's going to happen. This column is going to go from 50/50 to 100%. So our column has gone from this width to this width. Now they're all the same assets, all that's changed are the widths. Similar to the image boxes, they start off as 3 columns, but when I get smaller, what's going to happen is they're all going to start to stack on top of each other. Now, for mobile, stacking is generally how everything will end up, just because of the restriction on the size. So you generally need to stack everything in this format. But then when you get onto a tablet device where you've got a bit more resolution to play with, what you can start to do is go, okay, these images are going to go 50/50, those 2. And then what's going to happen to this third one is I could say I want this to also be 50/50 and sit underneath the left one as such. Or I could say, no, this one's going to get blown up to high resolution in its aspect ratio, of course. Now this is realistic. And then what I've just mocked up here is more of a tablet view that you'll see. Now if I just check that against my HTML file, there's the desktop view. Now if I start to drag in a bit, there we can see the tablet view. If I just compare that again to the Photoshop, you can see it's the same. So guys, I hope that has cleared up responsive for you and how I consider it and tackle it from Photoshop. Again, my job as a designer usually stops at this point, but at least knowing and having the skills of understanding what happens from Photoshop to HTML, it will give you a better sense of what the restrictions are and what you can and potentially can't do. Alright guys, thanks for watching and stay tuned.